very much, Jared. Well, it's been so exciting already this couple of hours in the morning, but it's going to be even more exciting going forward, because I'm going to introduce to you 4 breakout sessions. That will be an opportunity for all of you, and there are many of you in this room, to split into 4 groups and have a proper discussion. So each of you can participate and share your thoughts, ask your questions. So now we'll break for coffee for 30 minutes. And after that, we all will be going to 4 different rooms, 2 on one side and 2 on another. They should appear on the screen soon. So there are 4 groups. One is Insight on Funding Mechanisms for CCS in Europe. It will be in room Rotterdam Suite. Another one, CCS and Job Market Development, will be in room 2, Conrad Suite. Third group will be talking about exploration of CO2 storage in Europe, and it's in suite Cool Singer. And the 4th group on CDR and carbon removal certification framework will be in a room Markant. So you all signed up for different groups, and it should be written on your badge. If you haven't signed up, we did it for you. So you should have, but we gave you a chance. So please go to your room after coffee break. So the groups will be meeting for 1 hour. They will be facilitated by co-facilitators. Each group will have a co-facilitator that will offer you some scene-setting introduction, some questions for discussion. They will facilitate your interventions and discussions. And then at 4:30, almost the last session of today, co-facilitators will report back to the plenary of the key insights from each group. So if you want to be in multiple groups, but you can attend only one, of course, you will hear the insights from other groups in the afternoon. So please don't try to go to multiple groups at the same time. Just stay in your group. You will hear more in the afternoon. Well, this is our final session before the closing, where we will hear back from the breakout groups. So I would like to invite core facilitators of 4 of the breakout groups to come here as well. So we'll start our sharing of insights from each of the groups. And while the chairs are being brought, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank our partner organizations who help facilitate the breakout groups. So CCSA, the Zero Emissions Platform, the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, Total Energies, Clean Air Task Force, Professor Niall McDowell from Imperial College, as well as 2 of my colleagues, Mathilde Blanchard and Dominique Russell, who helped to facilitate 4 breakout sessions. So now we will hear from each of you of the key insights, because I'm sure all the topics in the breakout were interesting for everybody. Sorry, I don't know what's happening. And I think I don't have a chair anyway, so I'll be just standing. I've been sitting a lot. So maybe we'll start with Ed Hart, the finance, finance for CCS in the EU. Maybe, if you could share what the key messages, key insights, key questions were brought up in your group.
Yes, of course. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evard. I work at the Zero Emissions Platform, which is the advisor to the EU on industrial carbon management. I found it quite interesting that they asked a guy who'd only ever worked in non-profits how to make money from CCS, and I was meant to facilitate this whole session. It was quite a vibrant session towards the end, especially. It took a while to get going, I think. But I think we also had some slides. I think we were going to try and share the outcomes.
Yes, I think we'll be sharing slides.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, we kind of digested a lot of 4 key points essentially from what we discussed.
Sorry, Edhard, sorry, I gave the floor to you instead of the storage group first. Indeed. And the slides were on the. So can we move to the? Because I didn't realize. Sorry.
No problem.
No, but we can move the slides.
Oh, okay.
Let's see if we can.
Okay. You just want me to
if we can move to the next slide.
I can also just talk about storage as well.
Sorry for the confusion. Last session, lots going on.
So yes, we discussed first on the four key points. The first being in sort of market phases. So a lot of the discussion really is, obviously 2050 net zero, etc. But really, it's also we need momentum in the CCS market. And what we've seen so far is a lot of project announcements, but not a lot of final investment decisions. And with that as well, obviously we need to change or amend policy tools. But really, what we tried to focus on was particularly the deployment within the short term, and how can we de-risk investments, and what types of ideas are needed right now. The second key point, and sort of really the focus was on, what is needed today in order to make projects bankable. And what we've seen, at least, is a heavy focus in this session was really on what's worked well in the UK. And that was really where we looked at geography as well, in terms of things worked well in the UK because it's been de-risked, because we've had 200 civil servants working very, very hard on looking at every possible risk that could come in a CCS project, and then trying to remove them, or at least so that the government would take on a risk, and then as well bringing in the private sector, the finance people, to better understand that. That might work well for some places. It might not work so well in other locations too. And so what we tried to do as well was emphasizing the point that as well in the fact that different locations and geographies might use CCS differently, we may also need different types of tools that are available in order to do that. And I think one of the key messages really was, and I'm sorry, Daniel, I'm looking at you, is that really the ETS price is just not sufficient. The mood that I got, at least from the audience, was that there wasn't a very serious look in terms of the ETS price. Like, yes, 100 euros a ton, but now it's much less than your 100 euros a ton, and that dealing with that risk is actually quite substantial. And of course, you can mitigate that with a contract for difference scheme, which works well in some countries, but that also requires quite a lot of government intervention, and particularly the state taking on quite a lot of risk and allocating large amounts of funds that isn't really going to be the case in other parts of Europe in particular. And I think that's one of the key messages, is that we see a lot of these successful schemes in the North Sea region, and that's great. It's making projects happen. But what a real pain point was for the industries that are not located anywhere near these geographies. And we talk a lot about development of storage, and of course that's really important. But really the underlying point to that too is where is the funding for these storage, transport, and capture projects going to come from? And so really, and also looking at sort of the limits to what is available in terms of state aid and financing. There was obviously some discussion, as always, on the amazing US and the Inflation Reduction Act and endless amounts of free money. But of course, there is always a limit to free money. And that was really, maybe we need to be a bit more creative as an industry as well. And I think part of the discussion, especially, throughout in a way, and it came up, was a general openness, if I might say, to mandates. Some of that being sort of long-term mandates, looking at sort of towards fossil fuel production, potentially a carbon take-back obligation, but at least in the short term as well, looking at, okay, maybe we're looking a lot at carbon pricing and what we need to sort of mitigate the risk when it comes to the ETS. But we're looking on the flip side is also on the products that come onto the market. And I raised the example of H2 green steel being one, and I tried to avoid the hydrogen discussion, but really focusing on the creativity that happened around this project. And I think that's something as well that I think as a sector we can also try to be a bit more creative in both looking for a market, and we can mandate a market to become available for these low carbon products which are produced through carbon capture and storage. And I think there was also quite an openness, I felt, at least in terms of the room, to seeing action, and that action really has to come from the EU and the member state level. So those are the kind of four kind of key insights. Of course, you see some other points that sort of came up through the discussion. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And to use my privilege as a facilitator, I would like to add that we recently published a paper on EU funds. There are multiple funds that are available at the EU level to finance CCS projects, various stages of CCS projects, not just innovation fund. So if you're interested, please look at our website. I think it's a very useful paper with a lot of real-life examples from a consulting company, P&O, that co-authored the paper with us. So let's move maybe back now to the slide back, because I mixed up the order. And we have, I think, storage, evolution of CO2 storage. So Alicia from Clean Air Task Force, the floor is yours to share insights.
Yes. So thanks a lot, and thanks to all the people who participate in the discussion. It was a very lively discussion, and it's always good to have different point of view. So the focus of the discussion was really, now that we have an increased focus on CCS, we also have an increased focus on CO2 storage, with no mandatory targets in the EU. What are the opportunities and the challenge that comes with it? What needs to happen to have operational storage on time in Europe? One of the first points in the discussion was related to the concentration of the current storage project in the North Sea and what it means for the other part of Europe that may take longer to have access to storage. Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. What does it mean for costs for these industry located not in Northern Europe, but in the other parts that will need to access storage and that will have the choice to either pay the ETS price, pay quite a high cost to bring their CO2 in the Northern Sea, and ultimately, at some point, we need to develop their own storage. So there was the question about when and how are they going to develop the storage, what will going to be the timeline for that. And then there was also a discussion about why did Northern Europe move faster compared to the other part of Europe. A part of it is clearly policy support that we have been seeing in Netherlands, in Denmark, or in Norway. The part was also mentioned on the link with the oil and gas industry and the infrastructure and stakeholders that were in some part of Europe and maybe not in other, and that could take the lead in the development of the storage. There was also a question about if we don't have storage available for this part of Europe on time, can the EU start looking at connecting with storage outside of the EU? Looking, for example, at Northern Africa, that could be an affordable option for Southern European countries to export their CO2 storage. So that was kind of the first part of the discussion. There was another quite interesting part about the accuracy of the number we're having at the moment when we're assessing storage potential. So at the moment, we have very different number based on very different methodology, and sometimes we have no number at all. And we need clarity on where the storage potential are with a common methodology that would actually allow for comparison, but also with more certainty than what we have now. When we're assessing at the moment storage potential in Europe, we have massive potential gaps with like lower level or higher level, and it's quite difficult to assess what the actual potential is and where it is. On that, the atlas that was mentioned before could be quite a powerful tool, but of course it will depend on like the accuracy and the methodology of the data that it will include and be built upon. And of course, a lot of the actual information will also be gained in the process of building the storage. Regardless of like other factors, some storage will probably overperform and some will underperform, not due to failure, but just because of when we're building, we will realize there are more or less resources than what was expected. So that was another part of the discussion. There was also a discussion on how to better manage the risk of storage capacity. And on that, there was a suggestion on making sure we're building a broad diversity of storage sites so that we have different options in case of failure of one or the other. But there was also an interesting suggestion on making sure the different storage projects are coordinating so that in case there is an issue with one, it's quite easy to redirect the CO2 towards another CO2 storage, hopefully not too far. And so there is clearly a need of like increased coordination and cooperation there. Unfortunately, each time you talk about any topic related to CCS, you have to talk about money. So there was also a discussion about who will actually pay to develop this storage. Surprisingly, nobody wanted to volunteer to do that. So there was an acknowledgement that the ETS price is unlikely to be enough, as was mentioned in the other group, and also the lack of certainty about how much it will be require that other tools will also be needed. And so there were mention of carbon contract for difference, but also the role of mandatory targets can play there, for example, like we have in the NZIA. Looking more at like some specific sector, there were concerns about the sector that are not covered by the CBAM, for example, the chemicals, and what it would mean for them in the future if they are not that kind of additional layer of protection, and what can be done and should be done for this sector at the EU or national level. looking more at like what would be needed in terms of policy, the need for CO2 specification requirements and the different classification of CO2 was mentioned as something that the EU should be looking at. And there was a diversion of opinion about do we already have enough measure on CO2 transport or do we need additional one? It seems like in some countries it seems to be quite clear and in some other not at all. So that's probably also somewhere where we need more European coordination to make sure that it's actually clear in all countries and for all the relevant stakeholders. So that was kind of the main outcome of the CO2 storage discussion. And I don't know if my co-facilitator wants to add anything on that. Good.
Well, thank you very much. Lots of interesting insights and a lot of knowledge in your room. Great to hear. I think we should move now to Niall, because I think the slides were done in a certain way. So carbon removals and certification framework. Now the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try to match Evard and the pace of speaking. I'll do my best. So we had a good conversation around carbon removals, and we didn't focus so much explicitly on CRCF simply because of the very nascent stage. But I think we spent a fair bit of time initially just discussing, I guess, distinguishing between offsets, where you're maybe compensating for or somehow trying to avoid emissions by, not by avoiding deforestation, for example, and just distinguishing between the concept of an avoided emission and a physically removed emission, and emphasizing the fact that avoided deforestation, for example, does not correspond to a license for additional or perpetuating fossil fuel production in a non-mitigated way. Just getting that point of clarity is really important, because that is a prerequisite for understanding that removals are not therefore a mitigation deterrent. It's very much an and scenario. The other piece as well is that when organizations or corporations pledge for net zero across scope 1, 2, and 3, it's important to recognize that the balance of emissions across these different scopes varies depending on what type of sector you are. So just as an archetype, if you're a financial services industry, for example, almost everything is scope 3, whereas if you're a cement plant, the majority is scope 1. And so therefore, the agency that you have to get to your net zero by direct abatement will vary, and therefore the role and value of removals, again, will vary by sector. We were then starting talking about the views on CDR certification in general, and rather than sort of worrying too much about the what's happening nascently, the idea was, well, first of all, we need to know what good looks like, and we need to roughly converge on that quite well, and ideally globally, because many of the organizations that are procuring carbon removal at the moment, so for example Microsoft, these are global corporations, right? So in that context, you recognize that additionality, durability, and verifiability are key. So it needs to be something that's not going to happen anyway, that's going to last for a usefully long period of time. Carbon stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years, not decades, and so therefore the CO2 store ought to have some level of relevant durability. And you also got to be able to know, right? You got to be able to measure the carbon that's being removed from the atmosphere and verify that, because contracts need to be written and enforced on that basis. Being able to do things that happen today, so for example that you can physically remove CO2 from the atmosphere today and verifiably store it, is really important. So in that context, things like bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture are very, very useful, because the intervention happens now, the capital spend happens now, and the carbon is removed today. You don't need to wait for example, rocks to weather. The life cycle assessment, so understanding how much CO2 is being removed exactly, that's super important, because without understanding this carbon removal efficiency, you don't really have a clear sight of the value that you've created. And then we spent quite a bit of time, again, following the previous thoughts, how will this scale? Who's responsible? How will we pay? And I think, we got to a place where recognizing that, taxpayers, consumers, investors will all have a role, right? And this obviously has the public sector acting as an umbrella to both taxpayers and consumers. I think we need to be careful that we don't become overly prescriptive and thus constrain development. We've got an idea today what CDR looks like, but we don't know what's going to come on stream tomorrow. So identifying quality criteria as opposed to specifying pathways too much, for example, I think that's really important. the portfolio that will be deployed, so the balance between BECCS, DACs, enhanced weathering, and so on, that will vary around the world, and it will evolve with time. And so therefore the mechanisms for scale up will also not be uniform. The role of the public sector is particularly important today, but that also will evolve with time. And I think this sort of temporal evolution was the theme we kept coming back to. Thank you.
Now, just a question. Do you feel like the discussion on this particular topic is progressing, or you feel like we're covering the same issues? What is your assessment? Where should we jump next on this topic?
That's a really good question. I do think it's evolving very, very rapidly. I mean, the conversations we were having, say, last year or the year before, not remotely close. I think the clarity around what good looks like is really evolving quickly. So I think the next question is, what are the mechanisms for paying for these projects? Some of that evolves rapidly to what was previously mentioned around CCFDs and so on. But even if you're thinking about this from a financial services perspective, the role of, for example, securitization approaches becomes very, very important.
Thank you very much. So it seems like 3 groups are converging. There is a conversion in 3 groups on financial issues and how we can fund various parts of CCS or carbon management. So to Olivia, now you talked about job markets with CCS.
Yeah. So we had a discussion on CCS and job market readiness. I think it did focus quite heavily on the UK because we talked about 2 of the studies, one that the CCSA did last year and a follow-up that will be published next week. But the challenges, I think, are universal across the UK and Europe and wider. And so we talked about those first in terms of an aging workforce, very, very aging workforce in terms of oil and gas, and we'll be looking at those workers to transition over. There is competition, so multiple sectors would be looking to recruit and train the same people for infrastructure projects all at the same time, right across multiple sectors. A lack of job opportunity awareness, so not understanding what CCS is, but also what the job opportunities within that are, and then a need for training. So again, the aging workforce came into this, and in terms of the trainers are also aging, so how can we retain them and keep them there to train a new workforce? And then around the standardized methodology for forecasting job requirements. So sort of set out with those challenges up front, and then discussed, and some of these key points that came out is that I think whilst the size of the job market in CCS will be smaller than other sectors, it is critical because of the nature of CCS across many different sectors. So across hydrogen, removals, industrial decarbonation and dispatchable power, we've got to be able to sort the skills and the jobs in CCS to be able to roll out right across all these industries. In terms of communication, I think everyone agreed a need to better communicate the importance of CCS and to build on the generic construction skills for sectors which are not always perceived as attractive. So we had a heat map of the areas of the shortage, particular sort of key pinch points around welders, pipe fitters, which are not really traditionally seen as attractive now to a young workforce. And actually in the report that will be published next week, there was a study of 11 to 18-year-olds, and 67% of them had said, when asked, and this was in an area local to a cluster, had said they did not want to work in these areas and didn't want to work in climate change. So there's a lot of work to be done there, but I think just also in terms of explaining what these jobs are actually in practice, they're not office jobs, they're outside, and it can be put forward in a much more attractive way to some people than I think currently is done. A lot of discussion around apprenticeship and training programs at the moment, particularly in the UK, very fragmented and small, so there's some really excellent good practice there. Catch UK facility in Humber is excellent, but it's training about 40 to 50 apprenticeships at the moment, and so has got to be rolled out. And how do we do that? And the government has got a key part to play in terms of the framework there, simplifying the framework and increasing access to it. some discussion around the role of the Commission, Member States and UK government in terms of providing guidance on the job roles right across the green energy transition. So across nuclear, offshore wind, oil and gas and other infrastructure, what jobs are going to be required and when, how is that sequencing going to work out, and how would those jobs be able to, and workers be able to move between each of these. Many of these jobs are construction jobs involved in the construction of these facilities, so then they will move on. They're not all the long-term jobs, and so that's got to be very clearly set out. A good discussion around the qualification. So in the skilled area of the workforce, around the engineers and geoscientists, for them to be aware, because of the nature of the value chain that we are naturally looking at, there will be lots of different companies involved in different parts of it, and how do we make sure that they are responsible for the safety and the risks involved, and how do we make sure that they're communicating across each other and aware, looking at things like CO2 spec, and how is that managed across, and having that as a critical part. I think the point was made, we have to make sure that these first projects are successful, and this is absolutely key, and not an issue at the moment in terms of oil and gas. Running a single company might run a project. We've got to have multiple companies involved in this, some of whom are very new to the sector, and so how are they going to be able to be responsible, and who will oversee that? A bit around labour mobility. While domestic workforces and supply chains are obviously preferred, I think recognition that we do have a shortage, we have current shortages, and we are looking at a future shortage, so we need to look at international labour mobility and how we're going to compete on an international scale. Once we train these people, how are we going to keep them and not lose them to other jobs that may pay better elsewhere? And all that came to the overall, of course, end point around the need for clarity from governments in terms of the rollout and the scale, so that once that clarity is provided, then people will invest, and individuals will look to train in these opportunities because they can see certainty. It's not just one or two projects, it's going to be worth their while moving into this, and so of course that underpins all of it underneath.
Thank you very much. Yeah, sounds like you've covered also a lot of topics. And interesting that among the 4 groups, a lot of interesting and very important topics were covered, and it seems like you had a lot of expertise in your room. So it shows that there are many people here who are experts, who are the workforce on CCS, maybe not from the engineering side, but the people who understand how the value chain. So thank you very much for chairing, facilitating, and presenting to the audience. I think maybe we can spend a minute or two if there are any pressing questions right now. If you are not in a certain group, but you have an important question, let's give 1 minute for that, or 2 minutes, and then we'll move to the closure. Any questions? No, everybody is tired, ready to wrap up for today. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, round of applause. Yeah. Niall, yeah.
I assume that was for my question. No, just one thing to kind of just flag that sort of has popped up a lot, right, in the panels and in the discussion and the reflections just now. It's this, I feel like in CCS and CDR we've gone from, as a community, what is it? How does it work? What does it cost? Okay, how do we now pay for it? And we sort of go through the piece of something public subsidies, something about a carbon tax, but eventually this comes down to being an investment, right? Like money has to get spent, and it needs to be a good investment that attracts that will deliver an attractive rate of return. It also needs to be financeable. It needs to be something that banks and so on can work with. And I worry slightly when I hear so much narrative around what we need to have is a tax, or the tax must be high enough. And that narrative I can't reconcile that with what I hear from a lot of the financial sector when they're saying, well, in order for us to bank this, we need to see a revenue stream that makes sense. And where does that work? And so I think maybe the next step for us is to think a little bit more about, as you're trying to scale this up, working more closely with the financial sector, as well as project developers, as well as the public sector. That will be maybe the next thing.
Absolutely, very good conclusion. And actually, we have started working with the financial sector. That's one of our next milestones, to engage more with the financial sector, to understand better what their needs are, so they can understand better how this sector, how this emerging industry works. Yeah, so right on point. Thank you very much for this conclusion. Well, thank you. And now another round of applause.